Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Judge for Yourself. The Constitution of our country, which followed a very long and intensive struggle, and in turn followed a series of documents like the Freedom Charter of Four, proclaimed that we were going to be a non-racial and non-sexist society. That was the journey we embarked on in 1994. Yet recently, we've had some more than controversial statements, to put it mildly, about questions of race and questions of, as the government communications person was alleged to have said, that coloured people in the Western Cape were in oversupply, which itself created a huge furore and raised the question again, are we going backwards in terms of the construction of a non-racial society? Now, to discuss race in the challenges of South Africa, I have Neville Alexander, Allan Boesak, Mr. Radebe. For me, one of the remarkable features of South Africa was after 1994 that many white people thought, ooh, the monkey's off our back, we can go back to normal. And so what does it really mean? How do you engage with the historical legacies and construct a society in which race diminishes in importance and humanity increases in importance?
In the early and mid-80s, there was undoubtedly a very strong move in the direction of a non-racial future. But that was set back, as it were, once the negotiation process started. There's no doubt in my mind. And the multiracial ethos, that sense of belonging in different cages, was re-established. And today we're right in the middle of that. Now, how do we move away from it? There are a whole lot of things. In the longer term, we need to have fundamental changes in the structures of our society. Because racial prejudice, race feeling, race thinking is entrenched because of inequalities that seem to be perpetuated and that people begin to experience as quote-unquote natural. So that's the first thing. That implies making it possible for everybody not just to have a job, but to have a decent job, to have a job where there's some possibility of advancement, a more even distribution, if you wish, of resources, and so on. Now, that's, of course, a very, very difficult issue to discuss in a short period of time. What do we have to do? Because we're dealing with a capitalist system, we're dealing with all kinds of things that people nowadays try to avoid discussing. I don't feel we should avoid, but I don't believe that we can do it now. That's the one thing. The second thing is that those of us who have the power, and I'm talking about the politicians, about the scholars, about the media, like the TV and so on, we need to show people that it's possible to live in South Africa without ever having to define yourself in racial terms. In other words, to be an ordinary human being. It may be necessary for me in certain contexts to say, I'm an Afrikaans-speaking South African, I'm a Muslim South African, or whatever. Those things are by and large unproblematical today. But the moment you say, I'm a colored South African, I'm a white South African, you're in trouble. Why? Because there's a particular history to racial divisions in our society. So we need to create conditions where it is not necessary, where people will even feel that it's undesirable to have to define yourself in those terms. What does that mean? It means that we need to look, and we'll come later on to the affirmative action, I'm sure. We need to look at what it is that actually disadvantages people. It's not the color of their skin. As I always say, if you're telling me that because I'm darker of you than you are insulting me. I'm not disadvantaged because of the color of my skin. I'm as much of a human being, if not a bit one.
I've always thought you were very, very clever. That's what you're saying.
I'm just teasing you, but you know what I mean.
I know exactly.
I'm simply saying that because I've got a darker skin color than you have, I am not at all disadvantaged. On the contrary, in some respects, I may even be advantaged because of ultraviolet.
But the same thing. It shouldn't be for me to say, which I never have done, by the way. Gosh, he's clever for a black person.
No, but I mean,
which, by the way, is the converse problem.
No, I know.
Sorry, but you were nodding. You seem to be agreeing with.
Well, I mean, many people today talk as if non-racialism is some wishful thing that we've sort of grabbed out of thin air, some ideal that will never be attained. And I'm saying, but that is utter nonsense, really. In our lifetime, you and I know this, and Neville has just alluded to this. In the United Democratic Front, there was a practical way of living out the realistic thing that non-racialism can be. But in the 1990s, what has happened is when the ANC came back from exile, they were not part of that transformation that took place in our lives, in our thinking. I never thought of myself as a colored person. I left that behind when I understood black consciousness. I never thought of myself as of less value than a white person. I left that behind through black consciousness and through my other Christian convictions.
But more disturbing than that, if I could put it to you, is that the people that you spoke to didn't either.
No.
And that's what worries me now.
Well, but the point is when you come back and all of a sudden, one of the first things that we do is to reinstate racial categories, is to once again put in people's minds that I'm a colored, I'm an African, I am a white person. And the next thing that followed historically in the 1990s was then to ask, oh, so who was most disadvantaged? Therefore, who is most in the right to receive benefits from the struggle and from the new situation? But once you begin that kind of question with that way, you've got to find an answer that will lead you astray. And it's the poisoning of our climate, of our thinking, of our minds, that had caused us to come to a point where some people believe that it ought to be normal to speak about these issues, as if we did not know anything different in our experience. And that is, for me, the sad thing here.
So comes 1994. We inherit an unbelievably skewed society in which class and race are very overlaid, and in which black people have really had, the most shocking treatment for 300 years and more. So any government's going to have to address that one way or another. And because race and class are overlaid in this particular, that's always going to be problematic. So where does it go wrong then, as opposed to what they did or what the government's been doing?
There are a number of fundamental issues that are involved here. I think the first one is, and I want to stress this, it's a point that I always make and people don't like to hear this, that the only reason why we have affirmative action in South Africa is that we haven't had the revolution. Yeah. If we'd had the revolution, we would have confiscated all the property, the entire land, and the factories and the mines. We'd still have had major problems, but we would have been in a very different power position to deal with them. In order to make those people who sacrificed their lives, who were disadvantaged, oppressed, exploited under apartheid, in order to make them understand that it was worthwhile, you need affirmative action. And none of us can morally oppose affirmative action.
Correct.
There's no way we can oppose affirmative action under these circumstances. It's what we do, how we do it, that's the vital issue. And there, in my view, there is no reason whatsoever for using race in order to promote affirmative action. You can't fight race with race. You can't have racial categories as what Deborah Posel calls a site of redress. You can't have that because you're perpetuating race thinking, racial prejudice. We see the consequences around us all the time. In this province, I can assure you, affirmative action, the way it has been implemented, as Sibusiso was just saying now, the way it's been implemented, particularly, not only by the public sector, but particularly by the private sector, it has poisoned the atmosphere to the point where I can predict that the ruling party is out of power in the Western Cape for the next few years, definitely, because of the way in which affirmative action is identified, equated with the ruling party in this country. Now, that's only one side. The other side is, and this is what disturbs me most about Mr. Manyi's statements, much more than the actual racist overtones, it's the commodification of human beings. Yeah. It's the fact that you talk about oversupply, about over-concentration, about excess, as though people are just things, are just assets, are just commodities that have an exchange value. To my mind, the moment you start dehumanizing the discourse in that way, the language that you use about people...
But you do, in fairness to Mr. Manyi, he's not here, but let me just put this, it's really not about him. It's about the fact that his legislation that he's asked to implement,
I agree completely.
Commodified.
I agree completely.
That's what you said.
But the point is that we need to be very clear that once you go down that road, you're going down the road towards a gas chamber. It's as simple as that. Because you really are dehumanizing the people and stigmatizing groups of people in terms of their so-called value.
I know that you want to come in. I've got to take a break because I want to give you some opportunity. So let me just take the break quickly. Welcome back. Can I ask you, Dr. Boesak, on this issue of redress? Manifestly, we had to do it. Have to. Still
absolutely.
And it's the most pressing single question, seems to me, in South Africa at present. But what Professor Alexander is talking about is the fact that we've used the wrong strategy, and it's caused disaster for us.
Well, I mean, the idea itself, even as it is expressed in the law, I would be happy with it. But the implementation and then the subsequent interpretation of how you implement that is where the difficulty comes. I'm not sure, and maybe Neville will say that, whether, given our history, where color and race and privilege and oppression and exploitation fell together in the way that it had, not just in apartheid, but right from colonialism, whether you can untangle that so easily when it comes to the point of redress, but that's a different issue. I also want to say that, I mean, the one thing that South Africans must understand is that you cannot redress a question of overprivilege and underprivilege unless some people understand that I will have to give up some of these privileges that I have had and enjoyed as if it were my right, and which other people did not have. So, and I don't think that we have had an honest conversation about that.
That is true.
Neither do I think, Sibusiso, that we've had an honest conversation about race in the last 17 years. We've always run away from it. We've always denied it. And when I hear you say, well, Jimmy Manyi says what he says, but we mustn't say as easily it is racism, I think it is. One of our problems is that we mustn't pussyfoot around these issues, whether it comes from me, from a black person or a white person. Once we go down that road, you inevitably end up where Rwanda ended up, and you inevitably end up where other people ended up. And my thing is, unless South Africans stop denying the dialogue that you want, and rightly want, will not be an honest dialogue. There will be no integrity in it, because what we must do is, non-racialism is not just something to talk about. We are in a position where we are in power, so that non-racialism can actually be implemented, written into laws and into practices and into policies by government. And on that basis, you can then look at private companies, and you can challenge them on those issues, and you can even punish them if they then deviate from the law, because what they are doing is such a danger.
What would the law look like then?
Well, you're a lawyer. You can.
No, but I'm not. But you the guy.
I've got an answer to that.
Oh, you got, okay. What's the answer to that?
The point is that you need to examine what it is that disadvantages people. In the case of most, let's say, of the industrial proletariat, let's say ordinary workers, quote unquote, it's a question of education and training.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, that's what you have to provide. Not to make sure that there are 10 Africans, 3 coloreds, and 1 Indian. It's rubbish. Yeah, it's to make sure that there are competent people, that have been trained properly, and that they have the opportunity to advance. Break the old boys club syndrome, whether it's in the factory or the university. That's what you have to do. So the answer is very simple. You need to look, for example, with the university, it's very simple. You need to make sure that over a 5 to 10 year period, you create a situation where students who do matric, regardless of color, are able to compete fairly and on a basis of equality in order to get into the university. And there are many ways of doing that, focusing on particular schools, functional schools, focus on them, get the best students there, teach them, train them, give them academic literacy, and so on and so forth, so that by the time they come to grade 12, they are in the same, no matter how poor they come. I mean, I come from a very poor background originally. From a very poor background, but I could compete on an equal basis because I had a very good education, and that's the point.
But really, Neville, there the key is functional schools. I
yes,
mean,
no,
80% of our schools are functional.
I'm making that point. And the fundamental redress is about how do you restructure the educational system so that not 80%.
Well, that is the most critical thing of all.
I agree completely.
How do you decide? I want to give you a response.
The point is that before we come to what Dr. Alexander is putting forward, is that we need to understand what is racism. So coming back to the issues, racism has been described and defined and explained by those who are experts in the field. For instance, you have Du Bois, you have Fanon, you have Biko. You cannot, what I meant by Jimmy Manyi's statements and to a large extent what Paul Ngobeni said is not racism at all. It's because for you to be a racist, you need power and prejudice. And I'm not talking about this myopic power that people have, as some are called black diamonds these days. That is not power. I mean economic power, the power to oppress the other person.
But if I don't have power,
yes,
right, let's assume,
yes,
and I behave in an outrageous fashion to you,
yes,
you tell me that's not racist?
Judge, it depends what
if
you mean by an outrageous way. What do you mean? You'd have to give examples.
I don't want to start giving a whole lot of racist diatribe on this.
Let me give you a simple example.
Yes, okay.
People are graduating at Stellenbosch at the moment.
Yes.
A black student whose parents are coming over,
yes,
wants to hire one of the B&Bs, and she is told that it is full. But while standing there, white people
they
are moving in with their
yes,
beds.
Of course.
Yes. Now, the parents, on seeing this, on seeing what is happening, now they react to the owner. They react in an angry manner. They say all sort of things to the owner. All sort of things. For example, they say how. For example, they will say this is unfair and so on and so on. They shout, and maybe some people use language that is not acceptable in terms of vulgar language. Mm-hmm. Would you call that racism? So. Would you call that racism? The response, I'm talking about the response that the parents are meting out. That is not racism. That is mere frustration and anger. But who is the racist here? Because white people are coming in, but seemingly these black people are standing there because they've been told that it's full, but white people are coming in. So that's the context.
Everybody wants to answer. I've got to take a break, and I'm going to give you a chance. I'm sorry. Why does this always happen? I stopped you if you wanted to raise a question.
Well, I wanted to say that I think the people who argue that black people cannot be racist because they don't have power, that's a terribly abused argument. Really. The situation we are talking about now, Mr. Manya speaks from a position of power. He is in a position where, as DG of the Labor Department, he helped write the laws, specifically the one that is causing so much trouble right now and that they have to rewrite in certain sections. He has the ear of the president. He speaks on behalf of the most powerful political party. He is a businessman in his own right and economically empowered like very few of the masses that he thinks he might represent in what he says. So I think that thing that you say black people cannot be racist because we don't have power, we've passed that point. But, and it's not just a question of power and what I do with my power. It is also a question of attitude. When you say rightly that it has to do with our thinking, what is in our mind, my attitude towards you, even though I am powerless, if I have a racist diatribe against anybody else, it does not matter whether I'm in a position of power. The hurt and the dehumanization that Dr. Alexander spoke about is very clear. That's racism. And I don't think we must try to trivialize that because then we're not helping the dialogue.
Why I was surprised. I'm going to come here. Why I was surprised by what you said, and is this because you're a lawyer, and dignity is at the center of our Constitution.
Yes, yes.
In a sense, what Professor Alexander said quite rightly is that when you start talking about people in terms of we've got too many, too few, you're actually talking about commodities, and you're not talking about the inherent dignity of each soul. Yes. Which is really critical to the constitutional enterprise. So the fact that I may be on the same level as you, even a lower level as you, because I'm white and you black, and I make some remark about, well, you know, what do you expect from such a person? That's an inherently racist sort of remark which reduces your dignity. It doesn't matter that I've got less power than you.
No, it does matter. Like as you said, Judge, that we have a constitution, and the constitution commits us to the past in terms of looking at the past as we go forward, because it has these goals, as it has been described by Carl Clare and others, that is transformative in its vision. But now, for us to really move from to really move anywhere in terms of this transformative vision, we need to first understand and come to an agreement as to what is racism, because it has not been defined. Certainly, we do not have legislation in South Africa as other countries have in terms of criminalizing race and so on, where they define it as to what it is, and the courts then give effect to that in their judgments. But here, we still have a question: what is racism? Because if as Dr. Boesak has said just now, that black people can be racist, I cannot agree with that. The issue has been addressed, and those theorists...
You don't think any black person can be racist?
No, you can't.
Oh, no,
you
that's
can't be racist.
impossible.
You must have power and prejudice.
You desperately speak.
I think that we need to be quite precise. Racism is the exploitation of the labor power of one group of people by another group of people, and its justification on the basis of biology. In other words, on the basis of so-called racial features. Regardless of whether the people are white, black, or green. And historically, this has happened throughout history.
Yes.
You've got examples of that. So, just to put an end to the story about blacks not being able to be racist, it's not true. It's as simple as that. However, in the English language, in the past, until recently actually, and it's an American intervention that makes it, confuses the whole thing, in the past we've made a distinction between racism, understood in that sense, where in South African history, for example, whites were seen, not whites, all whites, but particularly the wealthy, powerful whites, were seen as racist. They were making money out of exploiting people in the mines or on the farms, etc. Between racism in that sense and racialism, which is an attitude of mind based on prejudice and based on the consequences of racial structures, etc., and ideology, race thinking, and so on. Today we don't do that anymore because we've adopted the American lexicon. We use the American terms instead of the British terms, if I can put it that way. So I think when Sibusiso talks about, for example, those black parents who responded, they were being racialist. There's no doubt about it in that sense. It's different because they haven't got power. It's different from being racist in that sense. Now, one doesn't want to get into those sort of niceties, but I'm saying that the argument that black people, or people who are, I don't know what black people are in this context, but for the moment, let's think people with black skins, for whatever that means, that they can't be racist. It's just not an argument. I think Andy Lam, Gritana, and others who make this point and base themselves on Biko and Fanon, etc., they're just misreading the text. They're misreading those texts, as far as I'm concerned. Secondly, a very important point, there is no law in present-day South Africa that defines what an African, a colored, an Indian, or a white is. There's no law. The Employment Equity Act refers to apartheid categories, and it assumes that we all know what we're talking about. But there's no law that actually says this. So in other words, you're putting the burden on state functionaries to decide whether I'm a colored, an African, an Indian, or a white. You're putting that, or you want to put you want me to self-define myself. If I refuse, then what happens?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Can I ask you, I'm running out of time. Sorry, you want to make fun?
No, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you this. People watching this program, if you could give them, what would the single most important thing we could do now to move, I don't want to call it back, perhaps beyond, to some form of non-racialism that we would...
Well, clearly, the first important thing we have to do is to get rid of all racial categories that we have brought back into our law books, into our way of thinking, and into our discourse. That is the first thing we do. The second thing we do, what Neville has said, is education, and not just in the schools. I'm talking about the churches, and I'm talking about the media, and I'm talking about all of those, because the naturalness with which we perpetuate the racial categories feeds the naturalist way with which we think we can perpetuate racism. And all of these things hang together. And it seems to me, to come back to what Sibusiso has said, to have this kind of discussion that we have now, not pussyfooting around the issue, not trying to run away from the issue, but saying clearly this kind of thinking, this kind of discourse in this South Africa now is totally unacceptable. And those of us who hear this must not trivialize it, but must say to that person who brings this into the discussion, this is not what South Africa is all about. So as sort of an education of our peers and of our children and of anybody that we engage with.
Well, sadly I've run out of time, but I can tell you this, that I want to get you back again. Professor Alexander kindly pressed that we should have an hour. He's quite right, we should have 2 hours and maybe more. And to pick up something that Dr. Boesak said, we've got to have these conversations. This is just one of them. This is a small commitment to a longer debate that this country has to have about what does it really mean to be a non-racial and non-sexist society, which is what our Constitution proclaimed. Most certainly, whatever our impressive strides have been, and by goodness, nobody wants to go back to the past, we have made impressive strides. How do we, when there are warning lights, how do we ensure that, in fact, the non-racial vision of that Constitution is implemented? Well, you've heard quite a lot of extraordinarily interesting conversation this evening. Judge for yourself. Good night.